The screaming started at dawn. Bill Anderson was 22 years old when he learned what his mother sounded like in agony. He was crouched behind an oak tree at the edge of his family's property in Bates County, Missouri. The summer of 1862 was brutally hot. Sweat ran down his face. His hand rested on the knife at his belt. He touched that knife 47 times over the next 4 hours. He never drew it. And that fact, that single detail, would haunt him for the rest of his short, violent life. But we will come back to that. Because first, you need to understand what he was watching, what the Union did to Martha Anderson, and why she never gave them what they wanted. She never gave them her son. The horses had arrived before sunrise. Bill counted 7 of them from his hiding spot in the tree line. He had been returning from a supply run. Flour, salt, a letter from a friend in Kansas City. Nothing incriminating. Nothing that should have brought soldiers to his mother's door. But in Missouri in 1862, you did not need to do anything wrong. You only needed to be suspected. The Anderson family was suspected. Bill's father had died 2 years earlier. That left Bill as the man of the house. His mother Martha, his sisters Mary, Josephine, and Jenny. They depended on him. And Bill had been careful. So careful. He had connections to Confederate sympathizers, yes. He knew men who rode with Quantrill, but he had never joined them, not yet. The Union did not care about the difference. To them, suspicion was guilt, and guilt meant interrogation. Bill watched as the soldiers dragged his mother from the house. She was still in her nightclothes. The sun was barely above the horizon. One of the men, the leader, had a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. Old wound, healed badly. Bill memorized every line of that scar. 2 years later, they would meet again. But that is another story. For now, Bill watched and listened. The leader's name was never recorded in official documents. History has lost it. But Bill Anderson never forgot his face. Some witnesses called him a Jayhawker captain. Others said he was regular Union cavalry. The distinction hardly mattered. In Missouri during those years, the lines between soldier and criminal had long since blurred. "Where is your son?" the scar-faced man asked. Martha Anderson stood in the dirt yard of her home. Her daughters were inside, ordered not to come out. She could hear Josephine crying through the window. "The girl was 14 years old, I do not know," Martha said. That was a lie. She knew exactly where Bill was. She had seen him arrive at the tree line moments before the soldiers came around the bend. She had seen him dismount, tie his horse in the brush, crouch behind the same oak tree where he now sat. She knew, and she chose to suffer rather than look at him. The first blow came without warning. The scar-faced man hit Martha Anderson across the face with the back of his hand. She fell, got up. Her lip was split. Blood ran down her chin. "Where is William Anderson?" he asked again. "I told you, I do not know." Bill's hand found the knife at his belt. His fingers wrapped around the handle. The leather was worn smooth from years of use. His father's knife, the only thing he had left of the man. He started to rise, and then Martha looked at him. It lasted less than a second. A flicker of eye contact across 200 yards of Missouri farmland. Mother and son. She saw him. He saw that she saw him. And in that instant, something passed between them that words cannot capture. Martha shook her head, almost imperceptible, a movement so small that the soldiers around her never noticed. "Stay hidden, do not come for me, live." Bill sank back behind the tree. His hand stayed on the knife, but he did not draw it. That was the first of 47 times he would touch that handle over the next 4 hours. Each time he almost stood. Each time something stopped him. His mother's eyes. What happened next would create Bloody Bill Anderson. But to understand why it mattered, you need to understand what Missouri had become by the summer of 1862. This was not a normal war. The American Civil War had officially begun in April 1861. Fort Sumter, Lincoln's call for troops, the grand battles that history remembers, Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam. These were the stories that made it into the textbooks. But Missouri was fighting a different war entirely. Missouri was a border state. It had not seceded from the Union, but it was deeply divided. The eastern part of the state leaned Union. The western part along the Kansas border was overwhelmingly Confederate in sympathy. And the violence there had started years before Fort Sumter. They called it Bleeding Kansas. Throughout the 1850s, pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions had waged a guerrilla war along the Kansas-Missouri border. Armed bands raided farms, burned homes, murdered families in their beds. The Jayhawkers, anti-slavery militants from Kansas, had terrorized Missouri farmers for years. The Bushwhackers, pro-Confederate guerrillas from Missouri, had done the same in Kansas. By 1862, this was not a war between armies, it was a war between neighbors, and the Union Army had decided to end it by crushing anyone suspected of Confederate sympathy. Order number 11 would come later, in 1863. That was the order that forcibly evacuated 4 entire counties in Missouri, burned homes, scattered families, created refugees by the tens of thousands. But even before that order, Union forces were already conducting their own brutal campaign. Suspected guerrilla sympathizers were interrogated, farms were burned, women and children were imprisoned. The Anderson family had been on a list for months. Bill knew this. He had been warned by friends. That was why he had been so careful. That was why he had stopped attending the meetings where Quantrill's men gathered. That was why he had tried to keep his head down. It had not been enough. Back at the farmhouse, the scar-faced man was losing patience. Martha Anderson had been hit 3 more times. She was on her knees now, covered in dirt and blood. Her hands were tied behind her back. 2 soldiers held her arms while the leader stood over her. "You are protecting guerrillas, he said. "We know your son rides with Quantrill. Tell us where the camp is. Tell us where he goes. Tell us something." Martha looked up at him. Her left eye was swelling shut. Blood dripped from her nose. "My son is a farmer," she said. "He grows corn. He raises hogs. He has never hurt anyone." The leader laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "We have witnesses, people who saw William Anderson with Confederate guerrillas 3 weeks ago. He was carrying weapons. He was with men who murdered Union soldiers." Martha said nothing. The leader nodded to one of his men. What happened next? The historical records are vague. Witnesses who testified later spoke of screaming that lasted for hours. They spoke of smoke rising from the farmhouse. They spoke of sounds that made them cover their ears and pray. Bill Anderson watched all of it. He was close enough to hear his mother's voice, close enough to see the soldiers moving in and out of the house, close enough to smell the smoke when they started burning pieces of the farm. He could not see everything. The house blocked some of it. The distance muffled the worst sounds, but he saw enough, he heard enough. He understood exactly what was happening, and he stayed hidden. Later, men would call Bill Anderson a monster. They would say he was born without conscience, that he was evil from the beginning, that no human being could do what he eventually did unless they were fundamentally broken from birth. They were wrong. Bill Anderson was not born a monster. He was made into one. And the making began on that summer morning in 1862, behind an oak tree, with his hand on a knife he never drew. The torture continued at some point. Bill was never certain exactly when. The screaming stopped. His mother had passed out or been gagged. The soldiers went inside the house. Bill heard crashes, breaking glass. They were searching for something or destroying everything or both. The sun climbed higher. Morning became noon. Bill's legs cramped from crouching. His throat burned with thirst, but he did not move. He thought about his sisters, Josephine, Mary, Jenny. They were inside that house. Were they being hurt too? Were they watching what was happening to their mother? Bill did not know. He could not know. And the not knowing was its own form of torture. His hand found the knife again. Touch number 23. One of the soldiers came outside. Young man, maybe 18. He walked to the well and drew water. His hands were shaking. Even from the tree line, Bill could see that. The young soldier looked toward the woods. For a moment. One terrible moment. Bill was certain he had been seen. He pressed himself against the tree trunk, held his breath. His heart hammered in his chest so loudly, he was sure it could be heard across the yard. But the young soldier just stared at the tree line. His face was pale. Whatever was happening inside that house, it had affected him too. Then he turned and went back inside. Bill breathed again. But something about that young soldier stayed with him. The shaking hands, the pale face. the way he had stared at the woods as if hoping to find an excuse to walk away. Not every Union soldier was a monster. Some were just young men caught in a monstrous situation. Bill would remember that. Later, in the years of blood that followed, he would occasionally spare prisoners who reminded him of that shaking young man. Not often, not enough to change his reputation, but sometimes. Mercy was rare for Bloody Bill, but it was not entirely absent. That is something the history books often miss. The afternoon brought a new development. A rider appeared on the road. Bill watched him approach. The man was not in uniform, but he carried himself like someone with authority. He dismounted and went inside. Minutes later, the scar-faced leader came out. He looked frustrated. He kicked at the dirt, said something Bill could not hear. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. The other soldiers followed. Just like that, it was over. Bill waited another hour to be certain, the longest hour of his life. Then he ran to the house. Martha Anderson was alive. Barely. Bill found her in the kitchen, tied to a chair. Her face was unrecognizable. Blood everywhere. Her dress was torn, burns on her arms where they had held lit candles to her skin. But she was alive. And when she saw Bill, she smiled. A broken, bloody, terrible smile. "I did not tell them," she whispered. "I kept you safe." Bill cut her free. He held her. He wept. And something inside him that had been human, that had been capable of mercy and restraint and hope, began to die. The night before the soldiers came, Martha had said something to her son. They had been sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Bill was cleaning his father's knife. Martha was mending a shirt. "William," she had said, "if anything happens to me, I want you to remember something. Vengeance belongs to God, not to men. Promise me you will not become what they want you to become. Promise me you will stay human." Bill had promised. He would break that promise over and over and over again. But that night, holding his broken mother in the kitchen of their ransacked home, Bill Anderson made a different promise. A silent one. One he whispered only to himself so quietly that even Martha could not hear. "I will find every man who was here today. I will find the man with the scar on his face, and I will make them understand what they have done." This was the moment, not the death of his sister Josephine, which would come a year later, not the Battle of Centralia, where he would earn his name in blood, not any of the famous atrocities that history remembers. This was the moment Bill Anderson became Bloody Bill, a summer morning, an oak tree, 47 times touching a knife he never drew, and a mother who chose torture rather than betray her son. But the story does not end here, because what happened in the weeks and months that followed would transform Bill Anderson from a farmer's son into the most feared guerrilla of the American Civil War. And the path from that kitchen to the killing fields of Missouri was paved with choices. Terrible choices that Bill made with clear eyes and a dead heart. The transformation was not instant. After that day, Bill nursed his mother back to something resembling health. It took weeks. Her injuries healed slowly. Some of them never healed at all. The burns left scars. Her left eye never opened properly again. And sometimes in the middle of the night, she would scream, remembering. Bill stayed with her through all of it. He was there when she woke up thrashing. He was there when she forgot where she was and thought the soldiers had returned. He was there when she asked for her husband, forgetting that he had been dead for 2 years. Each night he sat on the porch with his father's knife watching the road. They never came back, but Bill watched anyway. During those weeks, word spread through the Confederate sympathizer network. The Anderson family had been targeted. Mrs. Anderson had been tortured, and she had not broken. Men began to visit the farm at night. Quiet men, armed men, men who rode with Quantrill and wanted to know if Bill Anderson was ready to join them. At first, Bill said no. He had promised his mother, "Vengeance belongs to God, not to men." He repeated those words to himself every night. He held onto them like a drowning man holds onto driftwood. But driftwood eventually sinks. The men kept coming, and they brought news with them. News of Union atrocities across Missouri, news of farms burned, news of families displaced, news of men hanged without trial for the crime of having Confederate relatives. And then came the news about the women. In Kansas City, the Union Army was rounding up female relatives of known guerrillas, mothers, sisters, wives, daughters. They were being held in buildings throughout the city, crowded conditions, little food, no medical care. The official reason was to prevent them from supporting the guerrilla war. The real reason was punishment. Bill's sisters were not among those arrested, not yet, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The Anderson family was on the list. They had already proven they would not cooperate. And Bill. Bill was running out of reasons to keep his promise. Remember the words Martha whispered to Bill on the night before the torture? We mentioned them earlier. The words he would repeat to every Union prisoner in the years to come. She had said, "If they come for me, do not try to save me. Live, fight, but never become what they are. Never lose your humanity." Bill had nodded. He had promised. But on the day he finally joined Quantrill's guerrillas, a day in late autumn of 1862, Bill Anderson discovered something terrible about himself. He had already lost his humanity. It had died on that summer morning behind the oak tree, while his mother screamed. The transformation was complete when he finally rode out. But the man who joined Quantrill's raiders in the fall of 1862 was not yet Bloody Bill. He was just Bill Anderson, farmer's son, protective brother, man with a grudge and a father's knife. The blood would come later, and there would be so much of it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves because there is one more thing you need to understand about that day in the summer of 1862. One more detail that changes everything. Remember the rider who appeared in the afternoon? The one who seemed to have authority, the one who made the scar-faced man and his soldiers leave? That rider was not Union. He was a Confederate sympathizer, a man with connections to Quantrill's network. He had heard about the raid on the Anderson farm and ridden out to see what was happening. When he arrived and saw the torture, he had made a decision. He told the Union soldiers that reinforcements were coming, that a Confederate guerrilla band had been spotted nearby, that they needed to leave immediately or risk being caught. It was a lie. There were no reinforcements. But the soldiers did not know that. They were deep in hostile territory with only 7 men. They could not risk an ambush. So they left. Martha Anderson survived because a Confederate spy told a convincing lie, and Bill Anderson, watching from the tree line, never knew. He thought the soldiers had simply gotten bored or received orders to move on. He never knew how close his mother had come to dying that day. The spy never told him, never took credit, simply rode away and disappeared into the network of Confederate sympathizers that covered western Missouri like a web. Years later, after the war, someone would tell Bill the truth. By then, Bloody Bill was dead, shot through the head near Albany, Missouri. His body displayed for 3 days while Union women came to stab it. The man who saved his mother never got a thank you. History rarely notices the quiet heroes, but this story is not about heroes. This story is about what happens when ordinary people are pushed past their breaking point, about the moment when humanity dies and something darker takes its place, about a mother who chose agony over betrayal and a son who watched. Bill Anderson touched his knife 47 times that day. He never drew it, and every day for the rest of his life, he wondered what would have happened if he had. Would he have saved his mother sooner, or would he have died in the attempt, leaving her truly alone? Would the soldiers have killed her if Bill had been captured? Would his sisters have been arrested that day instead of a year later? There are no answers to these questions. History does not deal in hypotheticals. We know only what happened. And what happened was this. Bill Anderson watched his mother being tortured for 4 hours. He did not intervene. She survived. And he spent the next 2 years killing every Union soldier he could find. By the time he died, the official count was disputed. Some said 53 scalps on his saddle. Some said more. The truth is lost to history. But everyone agreed on one thing. Bloody Bill Anderson was the most feared guerrilla of the American Civil War, and it started with a mother who would not talk. The months between the torture and Bill's official joining of Quantrill's raiders were a slow descent. He tried to maintain normalcy, worked the farm, took care of his mother and sisters, went to church on Sundays when it was safe to travel. But every night he sat on that porch with his knife, And every night he remembered. The sound of his mother screaming, the crack of fists against flesh, the smell of burning, the sight of blood on the dirt of his own farmyard. Something happens to a man who witnesses that. Something breaks, and once broken, it cannot be repaired. Bill started taking rides at night, long rides through the Missouri countryside. Sometimes he would be gone for hours. His mother never asked where he went. She knew. She could see the change in him. "I failed you," Bill told her one night. "You saved me," Martha replied, "by staying hidden, by surviving. If you had come running, they would have killed you, and then they would have killed me. And your sisters. You saved all of us by doing nothing." Bill did not believe her. He never believed her. The guilt ate at him like acid. Every time he looked at his mother's scarred face, he saw his own cowardice reflected back. Every time she flinched at a loud noise, he remembered the times he had touched his knife and not drawn it. 47 times. He counted. He always counted. The counting would become a habit. Later, in the years of blood, Bill would count everything. The scalps on his saddle, the bullets in his guns, the men he killed, the seconds he gave prisoners to pray. Numbers became a way of making sense of the madness, or maybe they were just a way of not going completely insane. There was another survivor of that day, someone Bill did not know about, someone who would matter later, the young soldier, the one with the shaking hands, the one who had walked to the well and stared at the tree line as if hoping for an escape. His name was Thomas Harrington. He was 18 years old. He had enlisted in the Union Army 3 months earlier because his father told him to. He had never fired his weapon at another human being. After that day at the Anderson farm, Thomas deserted. He walked away from his unit that night, threw away his uniform, made his way south, ended up in Texas, where he worked as a ranch hand for the next 40 years. He never spoke about what he saw in that farmhouse in Missouri. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. But every night for the rest of his life, he had nightmares. The war made monsters of some men and it made ghosts of others. Thomas Harrington was a ghost. Bill Anderson became a monster. And Martha Anderson. Martha lived with the knowledge that her suffering had created both. The moment when Bill finally committed to joining Quantrill came on a November night in 1862. The weather had turned cold, the first frost of the season. Bill was sitting on the porch as usual when a rider appeared. It was one of Quantrill's men. Bill knew him slightly. They had met at gatherings, exchanged careful words. "They hit another farm last week," the rider said. "Family called Morrison. Father and 2 sons hanged in the front yard. Mother and daughters forced to watch." Bill said nothing. The Morrisons had never done anything, never helped guerrillas, never raised Confederate flag. They just lived in the wrong part of Missouri, farmed the wrong land, had the wrong neighbors. Bill thought about his own mother, his own sisters. How long before it was the Andersons hanging in their front yard? "Join us," the rider said. "Quantrill needs men who can ride, men who know these woods, men who have reason to fight." Bill stood up. He went inside. When he came out, he was wearing his gun belt. His father's knife was on his hip. "Tell Quantrill I am coming," he said. The rider smiled, but there was no joy in it, just recognition. He had seen that look in men's eyes before, the look of someone who had lost enough to be dangerous. "Your mother?" the rider asked. "Does she know?" Bill glanced back at the house. Through the window he could see Martha's silhouette by the fire. She was knitting, always knitting now. It kept her hands busy, kept her mind from wandering to dark places. "She knows," Bill said. "She has always known. She is just pretending otherwise." "And she approves?" Bill was quiet for a long moment. "She told me not to become what they are," he finally said. "She told me to stay human. Will you?" Bill mounted his horse, looked down at the rider. In the moonlight, his face was half shadow. His eyes were already dead. "Torix," he said, "I will not, but maybe. Maybe some things are worth becoming a monster for." He rode away that night. He did not say goodbye to his mother. He could not bear to. The next time he saw her, it would be after Josephine's death. After the building collapse in Kansas City that killed his 14-year-old sister, after the final piece of his humanity had been burned away. By then, he would be Bloody Bill. And Martha would look at her son and see a stranger wearing her boy's face, but that is another story, another horror, another step in the long march towards Centralia and the scalps and the blood and the legend. For now, this story ends where it began, with a mother who would not break, and a son who broke in her place. The first months with Quantrill were an education. Bill Anderson had thought he understood violence. He had grown up on the Missouri frontier. He had seen bar fights and feuds. He had hunted deer and slaughtered hogs. He knew what blood looked like. He knew nothing. Quantrill's raiders were not an army. They were something older, something more primal. They operated by rules that regular soldiers would not recognize. And they did things that regular soldiers would not survive. The first time Bill saw a scalping, he vomited. The second time, he looked away. The third time, he watched. By the 10th time, he was doing it himself. That progression, from horror to numbness to participation, that was how the war remade men, not in a single moment of transformation, but in small steps, each one taking you further from who you used to be. Bill learned to ride like a guerrilla, fast approaches, quick retreats, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. He learned to sleep in the saddle, to eat while moving, to shoot from horseback at a full gallop. He learned the geography of western Missouri like he knew his own farm. Every creek crossing, every hidden valley, every path through the woods that regular cavalry would never find. And he learned to kill. The first man Bill Anderson killed was a Union courier, young man, maybe 20, riding alone on a road outside Independence. Bill and 2 other guerrillas caught him in a ravine, nowhere to run. The courier had begged. "I have a girl back home," he said. "We are getting married in the spring. Please. I'm just carrying letters. I have never hurt anyone." Bill thought about the young Union soldier at his mother's farm, the one with the shaking hands, the one who had walked to the well. He shot the courier anyway. That night, Bill sat alone by the fire and tried to feel something. Guilt, remorse, horror at what he had become. But there was nothing, just a cold emptiness where his conscience used to be. Is this what it means to be a monster? He wondered. The answer, he would learn, was no. This was just the beginning. True monstrosity required much more practice. The winter of 1862 was hard on everyone. Quantrill's raiders scattered into small groups, too dangerous to operate as a large force. Union patrols were everywhere. The cold made travel difficult. Food was scarce. Bill spent most of that winter hiding in farmhouses friendly to the Confederate cause, moving every few days, never staying long enough to be caught, always watching the road. He thought about his mother and sisters constantly. Were they safe? Had the Union come back? He had no way of knowing. Communications were nearly impossible. A letter would take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. And a letter could be intercepted, could lead the Union right to his family. So Bill stayed silent, and wondered, and worried. The worry was worse than the violence in some ways. At least when he was fighting, his mind was occupied. But during those long winter nights alone with his thoughts, that was when the memories came. His mother's screams, the sound of fists on flesh, the smell of burning, the 47 times he had touched his knife without drawing it. Sleep was difficult. When it came, it brought nightmares. Bill started carrying whiskey. A lot of guerrillas did. It helped blur the edges, made the nights shorter, kept the memories at a distance. It was not a healthy coping mechanism, but in a guerrilla war, healthy was a luxury nobody could afford. Spring of 1863 brought new horrors. The Union had implemented a new strategy. If they could not catch the guerrillas, they would punish anyone who helped them. Any farm suspected of providing food or shelter to Confederate raiders could be burned. Any family suspected of Confederate sympathy could be arrested. And there was a particular focus on the women. General Thomas Ewing, the Union commander in the region, had ordered the arrest of female relatives of known guerrillas. The logic was simple. If the women were imprisoned, the men would have to surrender to get them back. It did not work out that way. What it did was create a new level of rage among the guerrillas. Men who had been fighting for political reasons were now fighting for personal ones. Their mothers and sisters and wives were being held in makeshift prisons throughout Kansas City. The conditions were terrible. The buildings were overcrowded. Disease was spreading. And in August of 1863, one of those buildings collapsed. Bill was 40 miles away when it happened. He was on a raid with Quantrill's main force. They had hit a Union supply convoy, killed the guards, and were dividing up the captured goods when a rider came with the news. The building on Grand Avenue in Kansas City had fallen, the one where they were holding the women. At least 4 were dead. Others were injured. Some were still trapped in the rubble. The rider paused. "Anderson," he said. "Your sister Josephine was in that building." Bill did not move. "Is she dead?" he asked. The rider nodded. "They say the building was already weakened. The Union knew it was unsafe. They kept the women there anyway." Bill stood very still. The other guerrillas watched him, waiting to see what he would do, waiting to see how he would react. He did nothing. For a long moment, he did absolutely nothing, just stood there looking at the ground while the news sank in. Then he walked to his horse, opened his saddlebag, pulled out a piece of cloth that had been carefully folded and stored there for over a year. It was Josephine's dress, the dress she had been wearing on the day the Union came to torture their mother. Bill had taken it from the farmhouse before he left, kept it with him ever since, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Now it was all he had left of her. Bill held the dress against his face, breathed in the fading scent of his sister, and when he looked up again, his eyes were different. The men who had ridden with Bill Anderson before that moment would later say that something changed in him that day. The man who had joined Quantrill's raiders in 1862 was angry, yes, violent certainly, but still recognizably human. The man who emerged from that moment was something else entirely. Bloody Bill was born. 10 seconds, he said quietly. The other guerrillas exchanged confused looks. From now on, Bill continued. Every Union prisoner gets 10 seconds to pray. That is all the mercy they deserve. 10 seconds, and then... He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. The Lawrence massacre happened 2 weeks later, August 21st, 1863. Quantrill's raiders attacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas. It was the largest guerrilla action of the entire war. Over 400 raiders. Dawn assault. Complete surprise. The results were horrific. Nearly 200 men and boys were killed. The town was burned. Survivors described scenes of chaos and slaughter that would haunt Lawrence for generations. Bill Anderson was there. He was not yet leading his own band. That would come later. But he was in the thick of the fighting, and according to witnesses, he was responsible for some of the worst atrocities. Bodies were mutilated. Prisoners were executed. The 10-second rule was applied with ruthless consistency. "This is for Josephine," Bill was heard to say more than once. The Lawrence massacre was a turning point in the war. It shocked the nation, it hardened Union resolve, and it led directly to Order Number 11. The forced evacuation of 4 Missouri counties that would displace tens of thousands of civilians. The cycle of violence spiraled ever upward, and at the center of that spiral, feeding it, driving it forward, was Bloody Bill Anderson. By the fall of 1863, Bill had his own command. Quantrill's raiders had fractured into several smaller bands, each operating semi-independently. Bill led one of the most active and most feared. His men were fanatically loyal. They had to be. Riding with Bloody Bill meant accepting that capture was death. The Union had made that clear. Any guerrilla taken alive would be hanged immediately. No trial, no appeal, just a rope and a tree. So Bill's men fought accordingly. Every battle was life or death. Every encounter was a potential massacre. There was no middle ground. The scalping had started somewhere in this period. The exact origin is disputed. Some said Bill started collecting scalps as proof of kills, to maintain accurate counts for his own records. Others said it was an intimidation tactic designed to terrify Union soldiers into surrender. Whatever the reason, the practice became Bill's signature. By the time of Centralia, the massacre that would make him infamous forever, Bill Anderson reportedly had 53 scalps attached to his saddle, 53 men killed and mutilated, their hair braided into his horse's reins. The scar-faced man from his mother's farm was one of them. Bill found him in the spring of 1864. Nearly 2 years after that terrible morning in Bates County, the man had been promoted. He was commanding a small garrison in a town called Lexington. Bill's band hit the garrison at night, killed the guards, captured the commander. "Do you remember me?" Bill asked. The scar-faced man looked at him. Recognition slowly dawned. "Anderson," he whispered. "You are Bill Anderson, the one we were looking for that day. You tortured my mother." Bill said. "You hit her. You burned her. You did things I watched through the window of my own home." The scar-faced man was trembling now. "I was following orders," he said. "I was just following orders." Bill smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "So am I," he said. The scar-faced man's scalp was number 37. Bill kept count. He always kept count. But even in the midst of all this violence, there were moments of unexpected mercy. We mentioned earlier that Bill occasionally spared prisoners. Not often, but sometimes. There was an incident in July of 1864 that illustrates this. Bill's band had captured a small Union patrol. 5 men. They were lined up, ready for execution. The 10-second rule was being applied. One of the prisoners was young, very young, maybe 16. He was crying, calling for his mother. Bill walked down the line, looking at each man. When he reached the crying boy, he stopped. "How old are you?" he asked. "16, sir," the boy managed. "I just turned 16 last month. My father made me enlist. He said it would make a man of me." Bill was silent for a long moment. "Your father was wrong," he finally said. "War does not make men, it breaks them." Then he turned to one of his guerrillas. "Cut him loose, give him a horse, point him south." The boy stared in disbelief. You are letting me go?" "I am letting you live," Bill said. "That is different. Go home. Tell your father what you saw here. Tell him what becomes of boys who are sent to fight men." The boy rode away. He survived the war, lived to be 78 years old. And every year, on the anniversary of his capture, he would tell the story of the day Bloody Bill Anderson showed mercy. It was the exception that proved the rule. The other 4 prisoners were not so lucky. 10 seconds, and then nothing. September of 1864 brought Centralia. You have already heard parts of this story if you have watched our previous videos. The train, the 23 unarmed soldiers, the execution in the field, Major Johnston's disastrous charge, the 147 Union dead. But there is always more to know. On the morning of the massacre, Bill was wearing Josephine's dress. Not wearing it exactly, but he had it tied around his waist under his shirt. A piece of his sister pressed against his skin as he killed. Some of his men thought it was strange. Others understood. The dead do not stay buried, not in war. They ride with you. They whisper in your ear. They guide your hand when you pull the trigger. Bill was not just a man killing Union soldiers. He was a brother avenging a sister, a son punishing those who had hurt his mother. He carried the dead with him, and he paid their debts in blood. When Major Johnston made his fatal decision to charge with 147 men against Bill's 30 guerrillas, he did not know what he was facing. He thought he was fighting criminals, outlaws, undisciplined rabble. He was wrong. He was fighting ghosts. The ghosts of Josephine Anderson. The ghosts of the women who died in that collapsed building. The ghosts of every farm burned and every family destroyed by years of border warfare. Those ghosts were very, very angry, and they did not show mercy. The aftermath of Centralia should have been the end for Bill Anderson. The Union response was overwhelming. Thousands of troops poured into Missouri, hunting for the guerrillas. Every road was patrolled, every town was garrisoned, but Bill kept fighting. October of 1864 found him still raiding, still killing, still counting scalps. The number had reached 53. Some said he was aiming for 100. Others said there was no goal, just an endless hunger for vengeance that could never be satisfied. On October 26, 1864, near a small town called Albany, Missouri, Bill Anderson finally met his end. The details of his death are well documented. A Union patrol spotted his band. A running firefight ensued. Bill, leading from the front as always, took 2 bullets to the head and 2 to the chest. He was 27 years old. The Union soldiers who captured his body were not gentle with it. They stripped it naked. They cut off one of his trigger fingers as a souvenir. They paraded the corpse through Richmond, Missouri, where it was displayed for 3 days. During those 3 days, people came from miles around to see the body of Bloody Bill Anderson. Some came to mourn. Confederate sympathizers who saw him as a hero, a fighter for their cause. But most came for something else. Union women came to stab the corpse, to spit on it, to scream at it. These were the wives and mothers and sisters of men Bill had killed. They wanted their own vengeance, even against a body that could no longer feel. Men came to kick it, to curse it, to express their hatred for everything Bill Anderson had represented. For 3 days, the corpse of Bloody Bill was treated with a contempt usually reserved for the worst monsters of history, and then it was buried. Unceremoniously, in an unmarked grave, the man who had counted everything, every scalp, every kill, every second of prayer he granted his prisoners, was himself reduced to nothing, unnamed, unmarked, forgotten by the official records, but not by history. Because the story of Bloody Bill Anderson is not really about one man. It is about what war does to ordinary people, how it takes farmers and fathers and sons and transforms them into something unrecognizable. How trauma begets violence, and violence begets more trauma in a cycle that can consume entire generations. Bill Anderson was not born a monster. He became one. And the becoming started on a summer morning in 1862 behind an oak tree, watching his mother being tortured while he touched his knife and did not draw it. There is one more piece of this story, one more detail that matters. Remember the tree where Bill hid that day? The oak tree at the edge of his family's property? He said he would return to it one last time. He did. In September of 1864, just weeks before his death, Bill Anderson rode back to his family's old farm in Bates County. The house had been burned years earlier. His mother had died. His sisters were gone, some dead, some scattered. But the oak tree was still standing. Bill dismounted. He walked to the tree. He pressed his hand against the bark in the exact spot where he had pressed his face while watching the torture. For a long time, he just stood there. One of his men waiting at a distance later said that Bill was talking, whispering something to the tree or to himself or to the ghosts that always accompanied him. What he said is not recorded, but when he walked away, there were tears on his face. Bloody Bill Anderson, the most feared guerrilla of the Civil War, the man with 53 scalps on his saddle, the killer who showed no mercy, was crying. Because even monsters remember when they were human. Even monsters grieve for what they have become. And that is perhaps the most terrifying thing about Bill Anderson's story. Not the violence, not the scalps, not the massacres, but the fact that underneath all of it, there was still a man who loved his mother, a man who mourned his sister, a man who had wanted to be a farmer until the war took that choice away. You have just heard one of the origin stories of Bloody Bill Anderson. There are others. The death of Josephine, the torture of his other sisters, the escalating violence that characterized every month of his guerrilla career. But this, the day he watched his mother tortured. This was the beginning. This was when the knife was first touched but not drawn. This was when the counting started. This was when Bill Anderson learned that he could witness the unthinkable and survive, that he could feel his humanity dying and continue to function, that the worst pain is not the pain you feel, but the pain you watch someone you love endure while you do nothing. That lesson shaped everything that followed. Every Union soldier Bill Anderson killed was, in some way, a substitute for the scar-faced man. Every execution was a reenactment of the revenge he could not take on that summer morning. Every scalp was a payment on a debt that could never truly be settled. The war made many monsters. Bill Anderson was one of the worst, but he was made, not born. And that distinction matters. If you have stayed with this story until now, you understand something important. You understand that history is not simple, that heroes and villains are often the same people, viewed from different angles, that atrocities are committed by human beings, not by abstractions. The Union soldiers who tortured Martha Anderson believed they were doing their duty. They believed they were fighting treason. They believed that harsh measures were necessary to end a rebellion that threatened to tear the country apart. Bill Anderson believed he was avenging his family, punishing injustice, fighting for a cause that was worth any sacrifice. Both sides believed they were right. Both sides did terrible things. And the people who suffered most were ordinary civilians, farmers like the Andersons. Families caught in the middle of a war they did not start and could not escape. That is the real lesson of Bloody Bill Anderson's story. Not that violence is justified, not that revenge is righteous, but that war has a way of destroying everyone it touches, even the survivors, especially the survivors. Bill Anderson survived his mother's torture, and he spent the rest of his life dying slowly, one atrocity at a time. Some deaths take longer than others. If you found value in this story, the Super Thanks button is how you support this kind of deep historical content. We do not tell you the simplified version. We do not give you heroes and villains. We give you the truth, as complicated and uncomfortable as it often is. Every Super Thanks helps us keep telling these stories. Now I want to hear from you. Martha Anderson never broke. She endured hours of torture rather than reveal where her son was hiding. That kind of courage, that kind of love, is almost beyond comprehension. But was it the right choice? If she had given Bill up, would he have survived the war? Would he have avoided becoming the monster he became? Would dozens, maybe hundreds of lives have been saved? There is no easy answer. Comment below and tell me what you think. Was Martha Anderson a hero for protecting her son? Or did her sacrifice ultimately create more suffering than it prevented? History does not give us simple questions, and I do not give you simple answers. That is why you watch. That is why you are still here. That is why you will come back, because the truth, even when it hurts, is always better than comfortable lies. Bill Anderson touched his knife 47 times on that summer morning in 1862. He never drew it. And everything that followed, the scalps, the massacres, the terror, the legend, all of it started in that moment of paralysis. One man, one tree, one choice, and a mother who would not break. That is how monsters are made. That is how history is written, not in grand battles and political declarations, but in farmyards and kitchens and the spaces between heartbeats. In the moments when ordinary people are forced to make impossible choices, in the silence between a mother's scream and a son's first kill. Bloody Bill Anderson died on October 26, 1864, but in some ways he had been dead since that summer morning in 1862. The man who touched the knife and did not draw it was the last version of Bill Anderson who could have been saved. Everything after was just the body, walking around, doing terrible things, waiting to catch up. Now you know. Now you understand. And now maybe you can look at the violence of the past and see the human beings underneath. Not to excuse them, not to forgive them, but to understand how they were made. Because if we do not understand how monsters are created, we will keep creating them, over and over, forever. That is the real warning of this story. That is what Martha Anderson's sacrifice teaches us. That love, even the deepest, most sacrificial love, cannot always save us from what we become. Sometimes it just makes the fall more tragic. Sometimes it just means we lose more on the way down. Sometimes a mother's love creates the very monster she was trying to prevent. That is the true horror of Bloody Bill Anderson's story. Not the violence, not the scalps, not the blood, but the love that started it all, and the fact that it was never enough. Thank you for watching. Thank you for understanding. And remember, history does not judge, history just remembers. What we do with that memory is up to us. There is something else you need to understand about the day Bill watched his mother being tortured. Something that happened after the soldiers left. Something that would shape every relationship Bill ever had for the rest of his life. His sisters came out of the house. Josephine, Mary, Jenny. They had been hiding inside during the entire ordeal, ordered to stay in the back room, ordered not to come out no matter what they heard. They had obeyed. But they had heard everything. When Bill finally entered the house, after cutting his mother free and helping her to a chair, he found his 3 sisters huddled together in the corner of the back bedroom. Josephine, the youngest at 14, was shaking uncontrollably. Mary was staring at nothing, her eyes empty. Jenny was whispering the same words over and over. "Make it stop, make it stop, make it stop." Bill stood in the doorway looking at them. His mother's blood was on his hands. He had not even thought to wash it off. "It is over," he said. "They are gone." The girls did not respond. Bill crossed the room. He knelt in front of his sisters. He tried to take Josephine's hand. She screamed. Not a small scream, not a surprised yelp, a full-throated animal scream of pure terror. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall, staring at Bill like he was one of the soldiers who had just left. "It is me," Bill said. "It is just me. It is Bill." But Josephine kept screaming. The sound brought their mother, stumbling into the room despite her injuries. Martha took one look at the situation and understood immediately. "She is in shock," she said. "They all are. They heard. They heard what was happening to me. Bill, you need to leave. You need to leave now." "But I—" "Now, William. Your presence is making it worse. Go outside. Give them time." Bill backed away. He left the house. He walked to the oak tree, the same tree where he had hidden for 4 hours, and he sat down against its trunk. And for the first time since the soldiers arrived, he wept. Not for his mother, not for himself, but for his sisters, who would never be the same. The war had reached inside his home and broken everyone in it. It took 3 days before Josephine would look at Bill without flinching. During those 3 days, Bill did everything he could think of. He cooked meals, he cleaned the house, he repaired the damage the soldiers had done. He worked from dawn to dusk, keeping his hands busy, keeping his mind occupied. But every time he entered a room where his sisters were, they went quiet. Every time he tried to comfort them, they pulled away. Finally, on the 3rd night, Josephine found him on the porch. She sat down next to him, did not speak for a long time, just sat there in the darkness, listening to the crickets. "I thought you were going to save her," she finally said. Bill did not reply. "I was watching through the window. I saw you in the trees. I kept waiting for you to come running, to shoot them, to stop it." Bill's voice was barely a whisper. "I could not. There were too many of them. If I had come out—" "I know," Josephine said. "Mama explained it. She said you would have died. She said you did the right thing." She looked at her brother. In the moonlight, her face was pale. She was 14 years old, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in 3 days. "But I do not understand, Isao," she continued. "How could you just watch? How could you hear her screaming and do nothing? I could not have done that. I would have run out there. I would have tried to help her, even if it meant dying." Bill turned to face his little sister. "And that," he said slowly, "that is why Mama told you to stay inside, because she knew you would try, and she knew what would happen if you did." They sat in silence for another long moment. "Are you going to kill them?" Josephine asked. "The men who hurt Mama?" Bill thought about the scar-faced man, the young soldier with the shaking hands, the sound of his mother's screams. "Yes," he said. "Good," Josephine replied. And that was all she said. She went back inside, left Bill alone with the night. But something had changed between them. Something had been broken, and something else had been built in its place. Josephine understood now. She understood what her brother was capable of. She understood what he was going to become. And she approved. That approval, from his 14-year-old sister, would stay with Bill for the rest of his life. When Josephine died in the building collapse a year later, Bill was carrying not just grief, he was carrying permission. The last thing his sister had ever asked him was if he was going to kill the men who hurt their mother. "Good," she had said. "Good." That single word, that simple approval. It became a mantra. Every time Bill hesitated, every time doubt crept in, every time he wondered if he had gone too far. Good. Josephine's voice, Josephine's blessing, Josephine's ghost, riding alongside him into every battle. The dead do not stay quiet. They tell us what they need, and what Josephine needed, what she had always needed, was for her brother to make them pay. Bill never stopped paying. The question of what might have been haunts every historical tragedy. What if the Union soldiers had never come to the Anderson farm? What if Martha had given them the information they wanted? What if Bill had drawn his knife and charged, dying in a hail of bullets? What if? What if? What if? History does not answer hypotheticals, but it asks them anyway. Consider this. Bill Anderson killed an estimated 200 to 300 people during his guerrilla career. Most of them were Union soldiers. Some were civilians accused of Union sympathy. Some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Martha Anderson was tortured for 4 hours. Was the exchange worth it? 300 lives for one woman's suffering. There is no moral calculus that can answer that question. No equation that balances pain against pain. No scale that weighs one death against another. But we can ask the question. We must ask the question, because if we do not ask, we learn nothing. We just repeat the same cycles generation after generation, wondering why the violence never stops. Martha Anderson made her choice. She chose to suffer rather than betray her son. That was love. Fierce, maternal, unconditional love. Bill Anderson made his choice. He chose revenge over peace, violence over reconciliation. The bullet over the plow, that was also love. Twisted by trauma, corrupted by grief, but love nonetheless. The love a son feels for a mother who suffered to protect him. The love a brother feels for a sister who died in a collapsing building. The love that becomes indistinguishable from hate when it is fed by too much pain. This is what war does to love. It does not destroy it. That would be simpler. Instead, war transforms love into something unrecognizable, something that justifies any action, something that turns mercy into weakness and cruelty into virtue. Bill Anderson loved his family, and that love made him a monster. Think about that. Sit with it. Let it trouble you. Because if love can create monsters, then none of us are safe. We all love someone. We would all do terrible things to protect them. The only difference between us and bloody Bill Anderson is that we have never been tested the way he was. Pray that we never are. There is one final scene from the summer of 1862 that deserves to be told. 2 weeks after the torture, Martha Anderson was well enough to walk. The bruises had begun to fade. The burns were healing. Her left eye would never fully open again, but she was alive. She found Bill by the oak tree. He was sitting where he always sat now, facing the road, watching for riders. "William," she said. He looked up at her. "I want to show you something," she continued. She led him to the spot in the yard where she had been forced to kneel. The dirt was still stained dark. Rain had not yet washed away the blood. "This is where I was," Martha said. "Right here." They made me kneel. They asked me questions, and when I did not answer, "Mama, you do not need to. Let me finish," she said. "I want you to understand. I want you to know." She took a breath. When they started, the pain. I could not think straight. I could not remember anything. I was just screaming, trying to make it stop, willing to say anything. Bill felt cold. But then, Martha continued, "Then I saw you. In the trees. I saw you crouching there, watching. And suddenly, everything became clear. She reached out and took her son's hand. If I talked, they would have found you. They would have killed you, or worse, made you watch what they did to me, and then killed you anyway. Either way, you would have been gone, my son, my firstborn, gone, Mama. So I stopped screaming. I stopped feeling. I went somewhere else in my head, a place where the pain could not reach me, and I stayed there until they gave up." She looked at Bill with those damaged eyes. "I did not survive because I was brave. I survived because I had something to survive for. You, your sisters, this family, that is all that matters. That is the only reason any of us keep going." Bill was crying again. He could not help it. "I am sorry," he said. "I am so sorry I did not come for you. I am sorry I was a coward. I am sorry I—" Martha pulled him into an embrace. "You were not a coward," she whispered. "You were a son. You did exactly what I needed you to do. You survived. You kept yourself alive so that this family would have a future. But the men who hurt you will answer to God," Martha said firmly, "not to you. Promise me, William. Promise me you will not throw your life away chasing vengeance." Bill hesitated. "Promise me," she repeated. "I promise," he said. It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie, but they pretended anyway. Because sometimes the lies we tell each other are the only way to get through another day. Martha Anderson died in 1864. Natural causes, the records say. But there was nothing natural about a death that came from a body weakened by torture, a spirit broken by grief, a heart shattered by the knowledge of what her son had become. She never saw Bloody Bill. She heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Missouri heard the stories. The scalps, the massacres, the train at Centralia, the bodies mutilated, the prisoners executed, the terror that followed Bill Anderson like a shadow. But she never saw it. Bill made sure of that. He never went home after joining Quantrill, never visited his mother, never let her see what he had become. It was the last kindness he was capable of. And when Martha died, Bill was 50 miles away planning his next raid. He did not learn of her death for 3 weeks. By then, she was already buried. He never visited the grave. Some things are too heavy to face. Some ghosts are too painful to see. Martha Anderson lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in Bates County, Missouri. The exact location has been lost to history. Her son lies in a similarly unmarked grave somewhere near Albany. Mother and son, united in death by anonymity. Their bodies forgotten, their stories remembered only in fragments. But this is not a story about graves. This is a story about choices. Martha chose to suffer rather than betray her family. Bill chose to avenge rather than forgive. Neither choice was entirely right or entirely wrong. They were human choices, made by human beings, in circumstances that pushed them beyond human limits. That is what war does. It takes ordinary people and forces them to make extraordinary choices, and then it makes them live with the consequences, or die with them. There are no heroes in this story. There are no villains either. There are only people, broken, grieving, frightened, angry people, doing what they think they have to do to survive. The Union soldiers who tortured Martha Anderson believed they were saving the Union, preserving democracy, ending a rebellion that threatened everything they loved. Bill Anderson believed he was defending his family, avenging injustice, fighting for a cause that was worth any price. Everyone believed they were right. Everyone did terrible things. And the only people who truly lost were the civilians caught in between. The families burned out of their homes, the children orphaned by violence, the communities destroyed by years of guerrilla warfare. They did not choose this war, but they paid for it anyway. Remember that. Remember that when you judge Bloody Bill Anderson. Remember that when you condemn the Union soldiers. Remember that the people who pay the highest price for war are rarely the ones who start it. You have now heard the complete story of the day that created Bloody Bill Anderson. A summer morning in 1862, a mother's screams, a son's paralysis, a knife touched 47 times and never drawn. This is how history is made, not in grand declarations, not in legislative halls, but in farmyards and kitchens, in the space between a scream and a silence, in the moment when a son realizes he cannot save his mother and must watch her suffer instead. Bill Anderson carried that moment with him until the day he died. It was the first thing he thought of every morning, the last thing he saw every night, the demon that drove him forward, the ghost that would not let him rest. Some men are haunted by their crimes. Bill Anderson was haunted by his inaction, by the thing he did not do, by the knife he did not draw, by the mother he did not save. And in trying to make up for that moment of paralysis, he became something far worse than the men who had tortured her. That is the tragedy. That is the horror. That is the truth. Bill Anderson was not born a monster. He was made into one, by love, by grief, by the unbearable weight of watching someone you love suffer and knowing you cannot help, if you understand that. Really, truly understand it. Then you understand something important about human nature, something that the history books rarely teach, something that might, just might, help us avoid creating more bloody bills in the future. Remember this story. Tell it to others. Not to glorify violence, not to excuse atrocity, but to understand, to learn, to be warned. Because the circumstances that created Bloody Bill Anderson still exist today. Injustice still exists. Trauma still exists. The impulse to avenge our loved ones still exists. And if we are not careful, if we do not learn from history, we will keep creating monsters, over and over, forever. until there is nothing left but ashes. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Martha Anderson did not break. Bill Anderson broke in her place, and the American Civil War was never the same.